Over the last few weeks, we've been discussing currency resets with John Butler, an expert who literally wrote the book on currency resets. But during these discussions, we discovered an interest in the euro, a mutual interest. And I've put together a book about how the euro dies. That's the title of the book too. But I discovered that John Butler, which was actually part of the creation of the euro almost, the preparations for the banking system in Germany to deal with this new currency. And he developed a unique perspective as a result of that experience. So, John, I know you're very passionate about this issue, as am I, but your insight is even more rich, I'd like to say, than Nigel Farage's.
Well, I was living and working for a German bank in Germany through the mid 1990s, leading up to the introduction of the euro. And so a significant part of my remit at the time was to try and put together a framework for understanding how the European interest rate and bond markets would effectively trade, what the sort of fundamental dynamics would be once you combined all of these countries and their respective banks and government bond markets into the single currency. And one of the first biggest sort of obvious questions that did not have an obvious answer was whether the clearly divergent credit fundamentals of the various sovereign countries would result in their bonds trading at a discount to, well, Germany, which was widely seen as it is today, as the European benchmark market. And so one of the first things to do was to look at those credit fundamentals. And this is where the problem became immediately apparent, was not only did certain countries, such as Italy and Spain, have far weaker credit fundamentals, but you could argue that those credit fundamentals would actually get worse over time as a result of the way EMU was structured. And that was a real red flag for me. That is, on paper, the idea seemed like a good idea. Let's have a single currency that should facilitate trade, investment, cross-border movement of labor and capital, you name it. But then you look at the underlying actual mechanics of how this was being done, and it kind of contained the seeds of its own crisis, if not destruction.
Let me stop you there. To make this really clear, if you've got governments issuing a currency, then the value of that currency is largely dependent on their creditworthiness. And once you create a disconnect between the government and the currency, you have a weird dynamic developing then where you've got a shared currency, so the German currency and the Greek and the Italian and the Spanish currency. It's all the same currency, but those governments that are actually theoretically behind the currency, issuing the currency, have completely different, as you say, creditworthiness. So that's where this divergence begins, and this differences between not just countries, but the key part is the governments, because it's the governments issuing the currency. So let's explain that divergence over time, how that divergence occurs.
Right. So what you're doing by combining all the various European countries into a single currency is you're not making the risk of bad or unsustainable government policy go away. You're simply transforming it from currency risk into credit risk. And the problem was that notwithstanding certain economic reforms that had taken place in Italy, in Spain, Greece, and so on, going into EMU, nevertheless, there were other underlying fundamentals that had not improved materially. And what I really began to focus on was relative labor market competitiveness and productivity growth. And what you found was that Germany was still experiencing a higher rate of productivity growth, as were a handful of other Northern European economies, whereas that wasn't really happening to the same extent in the so-called, sort of Club Med countries. And so while on the one hand, you're eliminating the currency risk element country by country by combining it into a single currency, the euro, the credit risk problem is actually exacerbated not only in the event that government finances aren't great, but in the event that that productivity differential continues, it implies that if there is price stability overall within the euro area, there needs to be outright relative deflation of wages in the less competitive economies, such as Italy, Spain, Portugal, and so on. That becomes very problematic for sustainable finances going forward because your ability to tax, your tax base, your ability to, well, in the past, they would have devalued their way out of problems like that. This chronic underperformance of productivity growth, there was no evidence that EMU would ever solve that. And indeed, it has made it worse. And you saw this already in the first 3 to 5 years after EMU began. You saw a significant deterioration in relative economic competitiveness, and it only kept getting worse after that.
But that was masked originally because Germany was struggling at the time. So it was initially struggling under the high interest rates. The way to think about
This is
this, you go ahead.
no, it simply wasn't really in focus because their attention was focused elsewhere. That everyone was focused on the presumed economic benefits of EMU. And sure enough, you have this brief economic boom in the Club Med countries, which is driven by having far lower interest rates than they had before. So you get property booms and you get booms in other forms of investment. But that was a one-off. It was a one-off, and of course, as a lot of booms do, they got carried away. They overbuilt big time. Entire towns in Spain were built that practically never became occupied by new residents. And there was some corruption involved with some of that. But the thing was this: so you had this what I called honeymoon period for EMU initially that gave a bit of a boom to those less competitive economies. But that was all gone after the first 3 to 5 years. And then when you looked carefully beneath the surface, there was this ongoing deterioration in relative productivity and labor competitiveness that was eventually going to blow up, eventually going to lead to a proper euro crisis. And of course, we saw that arrive after the global financial crisis of 2008.
One way to think about this is that when you've got many different countries, the pressure valve to try and rebalance trade between those countries is currency exchange rates. Currency exchange rates moving to try and rebalance economies. So if you all share a single currency like the euro, it's like sealing shut a pressure valve, one that Europe has relied on for an extremely long time. And every time in the past that they've tried to seal it shut by creating a common currency, it's ended in a disaster, with the same two countries almost every time causing that crisis. But all of this was known and understood going into the euro by so many people. And you're one of those people that was involved in, the plumbing of the system at the time. And you saw it as well at the time. How did anyone think this was going to work? I mean, at this point, that's my question. I can't find anyone who looks back and says,
Okay.
"Oh, I thought it was going to work."
Okay.
Everyone says, "Oh, we knew it was going to be a disaster."
Right. Well, look, there was a lot of optimism, and there always has been a lot of optimism that Europe could eventually overcome its traditional national and cultural divides, and that would benefit everyone. And I think to some extent this story is true, right? I mean, no one would deny that Europe has not made a lot of progress in terms of at least, not going to war with itself for quite a long time now, and we should celebrate that, absolutely. However, I wrote an essay many years ago now, after the euro had been implemented, when people were starting to wonder just how sustainable it was longer term. And the title for this essay was called "The Trojan Horse Battle for the Euro," because the way I saw it, the whole idea was really two Trojan horses being put forward into a battle by two sides with different agendas. One Trojan horse was the German Trojan horse. This was Germany trying to lock everyone in to the exchange rate straitjacket of a single currency, thinking that by conferring the benefits of lower borrowing costs on the less creditworthy countries, they would take those benefits and use them to become fundamentally economically more competitive through sensible investment and sensible labor relations that allowed for sufficient labor market flexibility alongside sensible investment to make everyone better off and raise everyone's productivity growth sustainably for the long term. That was the German Trojan horse. However, there was another Trojan horse, and this is the one coming from the Club Med countries, which is this. By getting the benefits of that single currency, and of course the power to influence policy at the ECB or other level, to the extent that it doesn't work quite as the Germans had hoped, to the extent that we do perhaps on occasion need to bail out a relatively uncompetitive economy, the political weight will be sufficient to force Germany to do that. That is, the Trojan horse is, we can still allow ourselves to not enter into true fiscal discipline, to not enter into truly sustainable investment, to not force labor unions and other organizations to try and be more reasonable with their wage demands. If push comes to shove, we'll just weigh on Germany and weigh on the ECB to, through a combination of fiscal and monetary easing, bail everyone out as required. And so you've had this battle going on, and it's clear who's been winning. It's clear, of course, that the second Trojan horse, the one put into the battle by the Club Med countries, has been winning. And Germany's starting to sense this now. They realize that, this euro crisis is not a one-off thing. It's going to be an ongoing, permanent feature of EMU that will chronically, without end, cost Germany a hell of a lot more in subsidies and bailouts than they had ever expected. And there's just no end to it.
You've worked with a lot of Germans, it sounds like. I'm German. I can understand where the misunderstanding came from. And it's the idea that people actually obey these laws and treaties. And in the German mindset, if you've got a law that's the Stability and Growth Pact, or if you don't monetize debt, or if there's an issue, a limit to the ECB and how much bonds it can buy and all this sort of stuff, all of these legal requirements that the Germans put in place as the condition for joining the euro, they thought that Southern Europe would abide by those rules. Now,
well, they also thought they would be honest in terms of stating what their finances truly were. We now know in retrospect that many countries simply outright lied about the state of their government and national accounts. And indeed, I worked for Deutsche Bank at one point. Deutsche Bank got in serious trouble for helping the Italian government hide the true situation of its finances through these elaborate long-term structured note arrangements and swap lines. And I mean, a lot of shenanigans have taken place. And you're absolutely right. The Germans are, in relative terms, a moral, legal people. Now, obviously, as we know, Germany has dark times in its history for sure. But culturally, that is, where they tend to come in at. Whereas not everyone who's a member of the euro area has quite the same legalistic and moralistic position on these matters.
so where does then the drive for the euro come from, given that there was all of this doubt and skepticism and it was just obviously not going to work?
Look, it's a political project, and I do believe that there were decisions made at a very high level back when Mitterrand was still president of France, that EMU was in their interest, and that Helmut Kohl, I think, may have even done a deal. Now, again, this is one of those things that one's never going to be able to prove. The fact is, Kohl saw himself as a historical figure because he oversaw German reunification, which is really quite a triumph, right? He's in charge when this is happening. And so he's willing to do a deal. And I think this is maybe the explanation. He and Mitterrand and others get together. And the fact is, had Mitterrand and numerous other European countries tried to somehow derail German reunification, just tried to make it more difficult, they could have caused a hell of a lot of problems for Kohl. And I think a deal was made. Basically, Kohl and Germany were allowed to go about reunification on their terms, free of outside influence. They could do it their way, and it didn't matter to what extent it impacted on other European economies, because it does. I'll get there in a sec. But the deal was then, of course, that EMU was going to go ahead at some future agreed date. And keep in mind the timing here. The Maastricht Treaty is, 1992, which is right at the, right in the middle of Germany rebuilding itself, reunifying itself, and so on. But what was this cost? Guess what had to happen? Based on Germany's affinity for price stability and the structure of the Bundesbank, Germany had to raise interest rates to very high levels by 1992 to prevent the fiscal largesse of reunification becoming inflationary. The Bundesbank wasn't going to allow all this money to be spent and cause inflation. By raising interest rates to the level they do, guess what happens? They sparked the 1992 ERM crisis. So I think when all this was potentially blowing up and potentially derailing further European integration, Mitterrand and others did a deal with Kohl. You can reunify Germany on your terms, even if it causes some temporary economic pain for us and potentially, messes up temporarily our currency stability. But longer term, you're going to do this, single currency deal with us. So I think that helps to explain a lot regarding how this was done, why it was done. It was a political project from the beginning, and the economic costs of these political deals is only now becoming apparent to Germans.
I think that's the key to understanding the whole story, is that this project makes no economic sense or financial sense or whatever you want to term it into, but the political drive for it is incredibly strong. And now you've got this situation where the economic damage is apparent to everyone, especially in Italian GDP growth rates, but also unemployment in Southern Europe, German trade surplus. All of these imbalances are growing. I write a lot in the book about how Target 2 is revealing these imbalances are growing. Let's not get into Target 2 because that is a headache of a story. But the point is, we've got these huge imbalances steadily growing. So surely this ends in disaster, and that is predictable.
Well, I mean, again, I don't want to go into detail on Target 2 either, but let's just say, given the fact that interest rates are effectively zero these days, Target 2 amounts to an unlimited line of zero interest credit for essentially any European government that wants to spend money for whatever reason. That is not a sustainable situation. And yes, longer term, it is going to blow up. And the costs are only growing with time, right? There are cumulative costs in something like this, and there has been no reversal, notwithstanding the bailouts of Greece, notwithstanding the restructuring of some Portuguese, Spanish debt, notwithstanding, all kinds of measures that have been taken in recent years to try and buy time. Not any of these has actually reversed in any way the course we're on. They arguably haven't even slowed the course we're on. And so the imbalances just grow and grow. And look, eventually, yes, the euro area is going to have to be restructured in some way. Now, some people claim, and this is not unreasonable, that it's just going to blow up. And that's going to be the end of it. And we're going to go back to a German mark and the whole deal. Now, yes, that's possible. I do believe there's going to be an attempt made to restructure the euro area in exchange for maybe allowing certain countries to do a one-off devaluation of their debt and reset their interest, their exchange rates in some way, in some fashion. And Hans Werner Sinn has proposed something along these lines. That is, you need to allow for a big one-off adjustment, but then in exchange, the quid pro quo is that you then have mechanisms that get rid of the Target 2 problem and force domestic governments to cover their own bank's capital flight when and where that begins to happen. So you take what is currently a tragedy of the commons, form of market failure, which isn't really market failure at all, but you throw it back at the countries themselves. So one-off reset, and then everyone has to bear a greater degree of the national cost of any future adjustments that are required. Something like that, I think, will be attempted. Whether it works or not, don't know.
We might just be on another run of the same sort of story in that scenario. It's anything's possible at that point. My argument in How the Euro Dies is that at some point the political will to remain part of this system is what dies, and the debts that were accumulated under the system are repudiated as part of leaving that system. So effectively, some of the countries default and leave the euro and go back to the way things were before the euro for them with floating exchange rates, and you get this pressure valve is released. The other counter argument is that the Germans actually start to enforce the law inside Europe. And there's lots of court cases. I think there's 3 or 4 at the moment in Germany about various ways that current policy has been breaching the Maastricht Treaty and the requirements on the ECB on its limits, to abide by its limits. Which of the two do you think is more likely? Do you think the Germans, I guess, pull on the reins of the Southern European countries, or do you think the Southern European countries try and leave?
Yeah, I think eventually you're going to get a surge in populism in the Southern European countries that is just uncontainable. They'll lose patience with Paris, with Brussels, with Berlin, and they will simply take things into their own hands. And it will be ugly and messy, but I think that's a very distinct possibility. Germany does not want that to happen. I mean, I think Germany would prefer some sort of negotiated restructuring along the lines of what Hans-Werner Sinn has proposed. But politically, that may be too difficult to pull off. One thing I don't think will happen, I don't think Germany will just unilaterally walk away. I don't think that. I think they will try everything in their power to try and keep some version of the single currency going. And I think they have several allies in that, right? I think most of the Northern European countries would agree with Germany that just allowing the whole thing to blow up is not ideal, would be very disruptive. I think pretty much all of them would be in that together to try and do everything in their power to restructure this thing. But eventually, I think the populism will carry the day, and you'll end up, therefore, with a Euro core centered around Germany that probably can continue. I mean, indefinitely is a big word, but probably can continue a long time while the mayhem plays out elsewhere around the periphery of that core.
What interests me about that idea is that it's what historically happened when Europe tried currency unions. It would go to what was called a Deutschmark zone, a zone that was basically just Southern European countries leaving and remaining with Germany, Holland, Belgium, and so on and so forth as part of what was really a Deutschmark using area, with monetary policy imported by a lot of countries around Germany. The part of that story that I don't understand is this is fairly inevitable, and it's leading us towards populism in either Germany or Southern Europe or a mixture of both. And the whole point of this whole story was that doesn't happen, that Europe doesn't get nationalist populism in all those different places. So it's precisely the thing that the Euro and the EU and so on and so forth was supposed to avoid is precisely where the pressure is pushing towards.
Well, you see this, right? We go in these political cycles, right, where politicians try to get some ambitious agenda enacted, and maybe it seems great for a while. Maybe people are quite happy with it for a while, but then some unintended consequences show up, and they double down, right? They try something even more grandiose, and okay, fine, maybe that works for a little while, but eventually the cycle comes roaring back the other way. And people just say, no, we don't trust you anymore. We're not going to give you that sort of power anymore. It really hasn't gone according to plan, and we're just not having it. And that's a feature of history. I mean, the Greeks understood this. The Romans, to some extent, understood this. At least the Stoics did. And I mean, this is just the way the world works, okay? And we're going to have to go through this now. I don't think there's any way you can really get everyone to come to the table without legacy, historical, anger and this or that, and kind of hammer out some fresh start, new way forward that is going to be free of some very serious political conflicts. Now, I don't think it's going to come to a war or anything like that, thank God, but we're going to see, I believe, before this is all over, the largest general economic crisis we've seen. That is, even 2008, 2009, and whatnot, is going to pale in comparison to what's going to happen, which is a shame. It's a shame we're going to have to go through that, but that's the only way I see possible for a proper deleveraging and rebalancing of the system. And it may well be a global event, but it's one that will, of course, have a very significant Euro component.
The way I try and connect all of this to our readers and what our readers care about is usually via the banking system. And interconnected banking systems, of Britain being a major financial center. So as a former banker, a reformed banker who was right at the heart of when this was created and saw how it would play out, can you connect for us how Europe's crisis becomes Britain's crisis?
Yes, I've also lived and worked in London for many years, and so I understand the linkages that you have here. And the linkages are very substantial. The fact is that London is not merely a financial center. London is arguably the leverage point for a huge amount of cross-border European finance generally. So even if the UK is not a net creditor to the EU, the UK's financial sector is involved in lots of cross-border credit arrangements. So, for example, as I said a few minutes ago, if Deutsche Bank is involved in structuring some exotic, whatever it is, vis-a-vis Italian banks or various governments in the euro area, and there are issues with those contracts, if some of these run into trouble in a payments crisis or whatever it is, even though Deutsche Bank may be owned by the German government and they may stand behind them, nevertheless, Deutsche Bank's London operations will be the intermediary that arranges a lot of this stuff and will have a certain amount of exposure to it. And this is true of the big French banks. It's true of the big British banks who get involved in a lot of this. Everyone knows that the big British banks have also been involved in all kinds of various structures for foreign banks and governments. So Britain is so exposed to this in a great variety of ways, even if it is not a net creditor to the EU. It's still going to get caught up in this when it happens.
So it would appear to be pretty much a rerun of the Lehman Brothers moment of 2008.
Oh, bigger. It's going to be bigger than that. I think the Lehman, not to belittle it at all, okay, but really what happened in the Lehman Brothers crisis was in fact more containable than people let on. And I actually think it was used by some people to try and get a bigger bailout for other things that would have had to have been written off. So they almost overplayed it, I believe. Now this is bigger. This is bigger. Let's look at some numbers. If you look at the Italian banking system, the amount of non-performing loans in the Italian banking system, I believe, now exceeds 20%. That is a huge number. And the Italian banking system is not small. It's not small at all. And the fact is that when you look at the nominal amounts involved here, I mean, they make one, actually, at the time, relatively small bank, from a global perspective, Lehman Brothers, look much, much smaller. The potential net write-downs, write-offs that are going to have to occur in order to clear these non-performing loans and the associated cross-border imbalances such as Target 2, which are kind of the mirror image of some of this, right, is so much bigger than Lehman Brothers. It is so much bigger. And the idea that the UK or any other country with a major financial presence in the euro, the idea that they're going to be able to contain this as easily as they did Lehman, absolutely not. This is going to be worse.
And on that optimistic note, John Butler, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Nick.
And thanks for joining us at home. If you'd like to claim a complimentary copy of How the Euro Dies, you can do so by clicking below this video. Thanks for joining us.